Arise and hail the glorious star.
So I'm Meek, I'm the president of the Federation of Old Cornwall Societies, but I suppose more relevantly for these projects is that I'm associated with St Gerrans Portscatho Old Cornwall Society on the Roseland Peninsula.
I'm Neale. For this project I'm associated with the Cornish National Music Archive, which is a collaboration between Lowen and the Institute of Cornish Studies. Three of our organisations collaborated on a Music of the Roseland project which ran throughout 2024 and was being planned throughout 2023. And out of that project grew the Carols of the Roseland project.
Yeah, for me, the project or the idea for the project started even before that, because the Cornish National Music Archive ran a project in Clay Country, which I went along to, which had a very good event at Wheel Martin with new compositions and various bits of music from the Clay Country. And arising out of that, I thought that it would be nice to explore the music of the Roseland with the Cornish National Music Archive and local groups. So I suppose that was the inspiration for why we started looking at music on the Roseland. I felt that it was kind of an unexplored topic. So getting together with the Cornish National Music Archive, but then involving Emma Campbell from the Roseland Music Society, particularly to do some of the practical performance side of the work, seemed like a good thing. So that was kind of where the inspiration was.
Emma wrote in a kind of summation of her involvement with the project, which we prepared for a presentation in a couple of weeks' time, that you'd emailed saying you weren't sure what music there was on the Roseland, and she said whether it was an innocent mistake or designed to get her interest or her involvement, it worked, because her family had been deeply involved in music on the Roseland for, generations. I think it's her mother's cousins were the Radford sisters, and in the earlier part of the 20th century they were hugely active, particularly in the classical music kind of side of things, setting up opera societies and running concerts and all sorts of things. If you look into the history of the Radford sisters, there's masses going on there, and their legacy lives on in the Radford Trust, which supports young musicians in Cornwall today by providing or lending instruments to them to play on if that they wouldn't perhaps be able to use themselves or get hold of themselves. So that's an important strand in music as the Roseland for the kind of classical side of things, but also for a lot of young musicians in Cornwall still. But there were all sorts of other things that came out of the music of the Roseland project, weren't there?
Yeah, I suppose my initial starting point is that I was really thinking about traditional Cornish music, and I didn't know much about that on the Roseland. What came out as we started to research, what we started to find is that there was quite a lot of classical music associated with the Roseland, quite often from people that liked to visit the Roseland and had been inspired by the landscape and the scenery, and had written. So there are two different compositions with the name of Behortha, which is a small hamlet in St Anthony in Roseland. And yet another concerto called Carricknath as well, and even we've an opera as well, which had its inspiration from the landscape of the Roseland, and also it was the libretto for the Morvoran was written by Maisie Radford, so links back into that. We certainly found sort of evidence for sort of traditional sort of fiddle playing, brass bands or fife and drum bands in the Roseland historically from the 19th century, and also some evidence of dance as well in the Roseland. So one of the things that we found that there were a number of compositions associated with the Methodist Church where people had written pieces of music with the titles of Roseland chapels as their names, sort of, so there were pieces called Ruan, Lanihorne, and St Mawes and Berrien and things like this. One of the people that we found there was a lay preacher from more recent times, actually, from the 20th century, that had written a number of these pieces, a man called Bob Martin, who had been a lay preacher from Truro and had written a number of these pieces. So as we sort of started the project and started publicising it and speaking to people, it's amazing how one thing after another sort of seeped out of the woodwork. You know, people would sort of mention to you, well, did you know about this person or did you know about that? And slowly we built up quite a reasonable collection of stuff associated with the Roseland.
Building that collection was one thing, and then figuring out how to bring that music into events or in front of people and get it out into communities was an important part of what we wanted the project to do. And that is where I think Music of the Roseland and Music of the Clay Country actually took quite different forms, because Music of the Clay Country had one big event, or one focal event at Will Martin that Neb was talking about. What happened in Music of the Roseland was a series of events throughout the year where different aspects of Music of the Roseland were celebrated at different community events and kind of tied in with different things that were happening anyway for the large parts. So that was a really interesting and useful way of putting local music and Cornish music and kind of bringing those conversations into spaces where they might not otherwise have been. So the first one just happened to be early in the year. It was the Roseland Music Society, so Emma Campbell's, she is the secretary of that. So Emma Campbell's representation there, with a concert that she co-organised in Verrian Church. But Ian Stevens is a contemporary composer who wrote Carricknath, which is the name of a headland.
Yes.
Opposite St Mawes.
Yes.
And he'd written this melodic line that mirrored the contour of the headland. So if you took this, there's a wonderful photograph of the headland with a musical stave superimposed on it, and then notes that trace the line of the headland to give this little melodic figure. Anyway, it's just an interesting way that Cornwall can be represented musically. So anyway, there was a concert of all sorts of wonderful, highly acclaimed classical musicians that performed this piece inspired by the Roseland. And then throughout January and February, Emma was doing workshops in the 4 Roseland primary schools using the toy symphony, the Porthscatho dances, and getting kids interested and involved in music and getting them playing instruments. And so there was that strand to it as well. And then the following day after the concert, there was a music celebration day at Gerrans Memorial Hall. And there were quite a few different performers at that, weren't there?
Yeah, so again, some of the children came along to perform the Porthscatho dances. Emma is also the director of the local band, which is called St Anthony's Noise, and they played throughout the day. Other local singing groups like Ros Kerr came along, yeah. And it was quite a sort of celebration of music. One of the other things that was played that day was called, I think it was called Waltz on the Roseland, which was a jazz piece by Mike Hitchens of Porthscatho. Again, another piece inspired by Roseland that we collected for that. Another aspect of that day was dance. Because the project found that the way that we dance the furry dance in the Roseland is different to elsewhere in Cornwall. Normally, people line up in pairs to dance the furry dance and then sort of hop and skip forward and then form a circle and go around. But on the Roseland, and again at Mevagizzy, I believe, people form up initially in a line of 4 and move forward. And I think it was only really recognised through our project that we did things different, which was quite interesting.
And so that was Merv and Alison Davey, who as part of the Cornish National Music Archive project as well, and they're obviously really interested in dance, so they were fascinated to have the experience of it's the Porthscatho ferry, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The Porthscatho locals dancing the Porthscatho ferry so that they could see how it was done, and then as they've said, so it was different to other ferries in Cornwall.
Well, some people have put forward the theory that that you can only dance starting 4 abreast if the streets are slightly wider. But I don't know how true that rings, because some of the streets in Mevagissey are quite narrow. But that's the only theory I've heard, is that the streets might be slightly wider where we. One other interesting thing we found during the research is that a family that had emigrated from Porthscatho in the 19th century had emigrated to Wisconsin in the USA, and they had corresponded back to Porthscatho, and there was this very long poem that they had sent back. And Philleigh, one of our local historians, Philleigh Thompson, had put this together in a booklet. And during the course of this poem, there was a verse that they said had been sung by local boatmen in Porthscatho, and it was evident that this verse was the chorus to a shanty. And we've got a local shanty group called Dú Hagawer, and we asked them to look at that and work with it. And they then composed a new shanty with verses, and utilising that chorus, so that we now have this kind of new shanty for Porthscatho that incorporates this traditional chorus, which was rather a nice thing to do.
Yeah.
I think, I guess where I'd started, because I was relatively ignorant of music and Cornish music, my thoughts had started with sort of traditional folk music. And we did find a couple of bits associated with the folk scene in publications. One of them was the oxen ploughing.
Mm-hmm. That had been collected and was housed in the English Folk Dance and Song Society's archive.
The version that had been collected was from a Joe Chenoweth from the Roseland, and it was incomplete. But as with all folk music sort of travels. Different communities make it their own, change it, and it becomes their own local thing. And the thing with the oxen ploughing is that there are lots of versions from elsewhere, including other places in Cornwall. So, we did some research work on the other versions of the song, and we were able to sort of come up with some thoughts on what it may have looked like. And then we were able to give it to a talented composer and musician called Martha Wood, who then completed it for us and performed it.
For he is the lad with the work along the plough. Oh, it's the little plough boy that sings in the morn. With his up along, jump along, he guides the plough along to pretty Sparkleberry, good luck, Speedwell Cherry. For he is the lad that can work along the plough. For he is the lad that can work along the plough. For he is the lad that can work along the plough.
So that was a lovely part of the project, to take an archive piece and have it reworked and reimagined, and that was the second. Well, there was another memory day. The second musical event was in late April as part of the Roseland Festival, and they let us have an event in St Mawes Parish Hall.
Yeah, the Memorial Hall in St Mawes.
In St Mawes, where we had Dú Hagawer, the shanty group that Neville was just talking about, We had a Cornish Troil, which is an evening of music and dance. So we had a Splan Ceilidh band come down and call some Cornish dances, which marvellously also included the Porthscatho Philleigh as part of this Troil. And Martha performed, she gave the premiere of the Roseland version of the Oxen Ploughing, which was rather marvellous.
Yeah, and there was a parallel example, because also in one of the old Cornwall journals was another folk song collected from the Roseland, which was the Herring Song. And again, it was incomplete, but again, the same process. You can find versions of this song elsewhere, including quite a lot from northeast England. So the song, again, we gave to Martha, and she was able to piece it back together and sing it again at this Troil. So there were two bits of folk music that were only there in the documents, in the archives, that we were able to give a new lease of life to through the project. And Martha then included both of those in one of her new CDs. So that was a really lovely thing to do. One of the interesting things that we did as a part of the project was that we held a memory day at the Heritage Centre in Gerrans, where we invited people from the community to come in and share their memories and their knowledge of music on the Roseland. And we invited another one of our collaborators, Mr. Chris Trevina, to come along and do some recording on that occasion, which was something that was really successful. But yeah, we sort of structured that day. We invited several people to come along at certain times throughout the day, so that we had people dropping in, and also we invited people to just drop in. And of course, I find that what's critically important with these things is providing copious amounts of tea and cake, and I think that makes these things work so much better.
Yeah.
But we had people coming in with bags of material, compositions, and one of the people that we met on that day was Yvonne Fuller from St Mawes, who brought in works that she had composed based on poetry, that we've got in the collection, that we must think about doing something more with at some point. But also what she was able to tell us about was the fact that she had a small carol group, small carol choir called the St Mawes Waits, that performed annually at the Tresanton Hotel in St Mawes. And also she was able to tell us about her involvement with the Sands Day Carol, which was lovely, because the Sands Day Carol is a carol that's sort of native to Cornwall, as far as we can tell. It's first recorded in Cornwall. But Yvonne was telling us that in the 1970s she had performed this carol up in the home counties, and she had learnt it in the Cornish language, having been sent copies by her aunt in Polperro. And then in the 1980s she had moved to St Mawes, and that she and her choir had continued to perform it in St Mawes and St Just in the Cornish language since then. So again, we had this Cornish language song, this carol, that had become part of a local tradition in the Roseland, and it was those sort of stories that came out as a result of that memory day that we probably wouldn't have collected if we didn't do that.
No, and having it an informal day where it was very relaxed and people could chat and remind each other of things, and bring up things that they probably wouldn't have thought qualified as music of the Roseland, but nevertheless were really important. So it was Elsie who talked to us about doing carol tours, wasn't it? Visiting different houses and going across the fields at night to sing carols, which is just a house visiting custom, which is lovely to know that there was on the Roseland. It doesn't surprise me that there's one there, but it's lovely to have it talked about and remembered by someone that could tell us. Yeah,
and one of the things that Elsie brought in, Elsie's associated with the combined chapel at Porthscatho, and she brought in a poem by a lady that we didn't know about before, or I didn't know about, and it led to a whole area of research about this lady, who went by the nom de plume of Christabel.
Her name was Florence Attenborough, and she came to Gerrans with her family.
Yeah.
Her father was a curate.
Yeah, her father was became the preacher at what is now the combined chapel that Elsie is associated with, but it was then the Congregational Chapel.
Yeah.
And in the late 19th century, her father became the preacher there, and they moved to Porthscatho for a period of time, which is where they would have no doubt met a lot of the local families in Porthscatho, including a local family called the Stodden family.
And Florence was evidently a talented writer, like clearly very creative, and was writing at a young age, and having her work published in local newspapers, but then became a professional writer and lyricist. I've got that right, haven't I?
Yeah, no, she absolutely did, because after her father finished his term as preacher at Porthscatho, they returned to the southeast of England, and she continued to write for newspapers. She published, I think, 3 different books, and you must realise that this is the time before the hit parade. I'm aging myself now, even saying that, because before downloads and before single records, we're talking about a period of time where sheet music was hawked from door to door, and that was the hit parade of the time. And what she was doing was writing the lyrics and inviting musicians to come and put the music to the lyrics, and then the songs would be sold as sheet music. And she was extremely successful at that. She would do things like write a poem and then send it to the Queen. And then, of course, the Queen would accept her poem, and then she would publicise the fact that her poem had been accepted by the Queen and put this all in the newspapers. So there was an amount of publicity that she did too. But research that we've done in some of the archives in London has actually found scores of pieces of music where she's written the lyrics.
Yeah, and she wrote the lyrics for something we haven't managed to see yet, which is A Day on Roseland, isn't it?
Yeah, a cantata.
It's a cantata, A Day on Roseland. So that was one thing that has slipped through the net of last year's project, but we will be following up because it's too good of a link to let go.
She married this man who came from Porthscatho called Richard Stodden. But they married and lived initially in the southeast of England, and then moved back to Porthscatho and lived in Porthscatho until she died in 1958. And she and Richard are buried in the churchyard at Gerrans. So
but Elsie remembered her, didn't she?
Yeah.
So that was the link with Florence, the quite unusual female professional writer and lyricist, and Elsie Thomas, who he spoke to on the Memory Day, remembered her and brought that story and all of her work into the project.
The thing about the Roseland, of course, is that it is a peninsula. It has the sea on one side of it and the sort of River Fowl looping around the other side of it. So we have these rural parishes of St Anthony and Roseland, Gerrans, St Just, which includes St Mawes, Philleigh, Ruan, Lanihorne, and interestingly, Tregony is not considered usually to be on the Roseland, but they like to advertise themselves as the gateway to the Roseland. So we quite often include them in the activities. But the character of the Roseland has changed over the years because of prior to the 20th century, a lot of transport would have been by sea and river. So certainly the connections with Falmouth would have been more marked historically. The roads in Porthscatho weren't metalled until the 1930s. So, and we don't really see road transport really becoming really popular until around and after the First World War, when you know, freight starts to be then moved by road transport as opposed to sea transport. So that it has that sort of character. So I suppose that reflects in some of the music that we, you know, some of the shanty music and some of the classical music as well looks at the landscape, and the opera that we mentioned, Ruan, that obviously means mermaid in Cornish language. So again, draws upon these sort of maritime themes, for sure.
I mean, I'm from the North Coast, so I feel like very much an interloper in this project, really. Never's the Roseland local, and I don't know the territory at all in the same way, but from everything that we did in the last couple of years, something that seems evident to me about the Roseland is that it's got incredibly strong communities. I know, you know, you're saying it's isolated, and I think it's another way we talked about that is that there isn't a major town, and it's not sort of en route to anywhere unless you're going to Falmouth by way of King Harry Ferry. You know, it's full of little villages, but those little villages seem so strong and so community focused. And one of the events, like the third musical event last year, that the project had a presence at was Philleigh, and I thought Philleigh was fantastic. I'd never been to it before and never heard of it even, which seems tragic that I've gone my entire life without knowing about Philleigh, because it is a old-fashioned village fete with all sorts of games and community store representation and food, and we were able to bring through the project some music into it.
You've forgotten the most important thing, which is the sheep racing.
The sheep racing. What was it? A bale toss, the sheep racing, coconut shy probably, greasy pole, whole lot, like all of the classic village fete games. I thought it was absolutely marvellous, and the hymn tunes that Bob Martin had written, he'd written one for each parish church in Cornwall. Have I got that right?
Well, yes, and he'd written a number with the names of chapels in the Roseland as well. Yes. Bob Martin had, and we were fortunate to get permission from his daughter that we could use them for the project.
Because he had passed away by this point.
Yeah, he had. Yeah. But the impact of that, of course, is that they were still the family's copyright. But the family were happy for us to have them and use them for the purposes of the project.
Yeah.
Which we did by involving
Hannah Hawken. So we arranged with Philleigh that they would be able to host an Austral band to play at the fair, and they played a whole range of proper crowd pleasers, but the thing that we were really pleased that they could play and have performed and heard was a medley. It wasn't really a medley doesn't really do it justice, because Hannah Hawken did a wonderful job of knitting together 4 of Bob Martin's hymn tunes, or representing the different churches, into a new piece for brass band, which again has now gone into their repertoire and have these bits of music with Roseland relevance back in circulation and being heard and being played and being used. And Bob's daughter and her husband came to the fair and heard them, and she was delighted, wasn't she?
It was the most pleasing thing for me of the experience, was that Bob's daughter came and heard them and recognised her father's music within Hannah's composition, and was very touched and pleased with what we had done. And that gives you that warm feeling then that you've done something really quite special. So that was really nice. During the course of this sort of year of looking at Roseland music, we started to identify carols, and the Old Cornwall movement has been involved for quite some period of time now in promoting the regional carols of Cornwall. And you've been very much involved with that, from starting with carols of the diaspora and things like that.
I think it predates that, really. It was Bude that had the first Truro Cathedral service. I think it was in 2016. And there was a service of Bude Stratton's carols in Truro Cathedral. And then I was involved in putting together the music for a service of diaspora carols, which happened in 2018, which was wonderful. We had 3 carols from Australia, 3 carols from Grass Valley. Those 2 represented the areas that I'd researched in my PhD. And then we chose 3 carols that would have been popular at home at the same sort of time. So we had this service of home and away carols, if you like. And then there would have been a service in 2020 for St Ives, but it was delayed by a year for COVID. So that happened in 2021, and that was to celebrate the centenary of St Ives Old Cornwall Society, but also the Old Cornwall movement as a whole. I've got that right, haven't I?
Yeah.
And that was marvellous. I was lucky enough to be singing in that one, and that was the St Ives Combined Chapels Cornish Carol Choir with support from the Red River Singers. And so by that point, there seemed to be some momentum behind bringing Cornish regional carols into the cathedral. And the following service after that, which was in 2023, was the Padstow Carols, which is where it all started for me. I started singing with them 15 years ago this Christmas. And then because the music of the Roseland Project had thrown up carols in quite a lot of different guises, we talked between ourselves and talked to the cathedral and talked to Bert and talked to others, and there was a service of Roseland Cornish carols at the Truro Cathedral last year. But that was one part of a whole kind of supplementary project of Roseland carols.
Bert Biscoe and Truro Old Cornwall Society have been a large part of organising those carols at the cathedral. And intervening that, another one we did was Redruth carols.
Oh, that's
which
right.
we did down at St Andrew's Church in Redruth. So the backdrop there was that the Old Cornwall movement had been really working to promote these regional Cornish carols, and quite often publishing the music or republishing some of the music in Padstow's case to try and keep it going. You know, I mean, the Old Cornwall movement aren't the only people doing that. You know, people like Hilary Coleman and her book on carols is again significant
Hugely
in this field.
Important.
But again, the Old Cornwall movement are really trying to promote that, more of that. So that was in the background. So we'd got this music of the Roseland Project, but it had starting to throw up carols as well. So it seemed like a good idea to continue, but to do something with the carols, which we developed as a sort of separate project. But they were really connected, partly because of the complexities, managing the complexities. But also in terms of fundraising, because one of the things that we did with the Carol Project is that we purposely got funding from lots of local groups. So we were looking for small amounts of funding from local groups. So all of the parish councils on the Roseland chipped in an amount of money to fund it, a number of the parochial church councils. And the reason for doing that is that we really wanted the project to be a community project. We wanted the community on the Roseland to feel that they had ownership. And part of the way of doing that was getting them involved in the funding. And I think that was really successful.
What we should say is what they were funding as well. So it was the idea of the service was one thing, and there were costs associated with that, and it was a complicated thing, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a second. But the other thing that needed support was the publication of a book, because we brought how many different carols from how many different sources together?
Over 40 carols.
Over 40 carols from, now let's think about the places we got them from the Cornish Songbook. So there were, I think, 7 carols that were in Ralph Dunstan's Cornish Songbook that were provided to him by, I think, a Mr. Francis Dunstone, whose family were from Portlow.
Yeah.
So he provided Portlow manuscripts of these 7 carols. We looked in historic newspapers for examples of carol services or concerts and what had been sung in churches on the Roseland, and you found some interesting ones there, didn't you?
Yeah, we found some accounts of carol services in Philleigh and in Gerrans parish, and where they had named the sort of carols that were sung there on those occasions.
And that was around 1902, 1903, that kind of time.
It was, and the really fun thing was that one of those concerts had taken place in the school at Philleigh, and the school at Philleigh is now no longer. It's now used as the village hall. But when I went round to speak to all of the parish councils, it turns out that Philleigh is so small that it doesn't have a parish council. It has a parish meeting, and the parish meeting meets once a year. But the upshot of that is that about, 75% of the population of the entire parish turns up for their annual parish meeting. So I went to speak to them and tell them about our project, and to tell them about the carol concert that had taken place in 1902 in their schoolroom. But of course, whilst I was doing that, we were actually meeting, and I was standing in the same room where that concert had taken place back in 1902. And when I was telling them about it, the impact of that was obvious on the people that I was speaking to. They were extremely pleased that this event that had taken place there, where they were sitting, and consequently they chipped in with some money for the project. So
there were newspaper reports from the early 20th century, and then we did a bit of detective work, because there was a list of 7 carols, and we thought, and those ones sort of weren't ones that traditionally appeared in your Heath books, in your Cornish carol books, but we thought, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could find where all those had come from? And they sang something quite unusual, which is a carol called Softly the Night. And the only place in Cornwall I've ever also heard that sung was in Padstow. And because I started singing with the Padstow carols, I'd done some preliminary research into what they sing, and I found that Softly the Night was published in a book called The Empire Carol Book in about 1901 or 1902, and we have Christine Edwards to thank for helping us track down a likely publication date for this, and we'll talk more about Christine in a minute, I'm sure. But all of those 7 carols that were sung as part of this carol service appear in the Empire Carol Book, which was published in London by Pitman and Hart, which is a big music publisher. But it was quite fun sort of looking across and cross-checking, like, oh yeah, well, all those are all in here as well. And then when you look I thought, well, I wonder if we can find any mentions of the Empire Carol Book in Cornwall. And looking in the British Newspaper Archive, this year, I'm pretty sure it was this year, in 1902 or 3, whichever the year of the service was, Hurd's Music Shop in Truro had advertised that they had the Empire Carol Book for sale alongside Heath's Cornish Carol Books. So that was a nice thing. It's like, right, well, this was definitely available in Cornwall at the time and being sold alongside local material. So that was a fun thing. So the 7 carols from... Is it 7 from both? 7 from
no, it was
Dunstan?
The 7 or so that we'd found from the newspapers and that. Through Kate's research, we were able to satisfy ourselves as pretty sure that the source for them had been the Empire Carol Book, because they were all in there, and as Kate says, they had been advertised in the local newspapers for sale. So being able to get back to a source that we could be confident of was a real great thing to be able to do.
And there are some lovely carols in there. Softly the Night, I think Rolling Downwards is in there, and List Our Merry Carol, all sorts of lesser known carols that are wonderful to include in the Roseland Carol Book. Another newspaper find was Rouse Rouse, which again is a Padstow carol as far as I and probably everybody else is concerned. but well, especially because it was published in the 1920s by Novello, another London publisher. But here it is. Rouse Rouse from Your Numbers, a traditional Cornish carol. This carol was recorded from a rendering given on Christmas Eve 1921 by Mrs. Ellen Lobb, then aged 86, who lived all her life at Penrose in St Gerrans, Cornwall, so about 2 miles from where I currently live. But Emma, the lovely Emma from Roseland Music Society, had found a copy of this leafed in with the Radford sisters' copy of the Cornish songbook. And so we had this carol, and I'm like, well, they obviously had a copy of it. That's interesting. But then we found a newspaper report about a BBC, a concert that had taken place, I want to say in St Mawes.
It was in St Mawes in the 1930s.
In the 1930s, of a concert that the Radfords had been involved with, where Rouse Rouse was performed, and it was broadcast on the BBC. So again, we found a Roseland connection for Rouse Rouse, which has meant that Rouse Rouse has ended up in the Roseland Carol book as well. What other sources have we got for?
Well, we mentioned earlier that Tregony regards itself as the gateway to the Roseland, but one of the other reasons to include them in the project was that there's a book published by or written by a guy called Benjamin Barnicott called Old Cornish Carols, and that was published in 1927, and it includes manuscripts from his grandfather Francis Woolcock of Tregony. And so this provided us with a source for quite a number of other carols that we've used quite extensively in the project.
Yeah, I think there's altogether, I want to say, 12 carols in this book. And they're taken from a manuscript, as Neb says, that belonged to the grandfather Francis Woolcock, who was born in Tregony in 1810 and died in Tregony in 1888. And he writes in the preface, the manuscripts are only a part of my late grandfather's extensive collection of old music. I often heard my grandfather speak of them as tunes and pieces sung and played in the days of Wesley. And there's quite an interesting story here where those manuscripts seem to have ended up in Lancashire and then come home from there. Like, he thinks that the carols were practised from manuscript in Lancashire and sung at Christmastide by choirs, mostly descendants of Cornishmen who 60 or 70 years ago migrated north as pioneers in the iron ore mining industry. They introduced the carols to the northern counties. Now, I'm sure Sheffield would say they've got their it's not just Cornish carols that have gone up to make the Sheffield and the northern traditions, but it's a fascinating story, and the 12 that are in this book, some of them are actually very old. I think they're probably the oldest pieces that we managed to uncover. Some of them date from the really early 19th century, and have come to Cornwall from elsewhere and been, evidently painstakingly copied down into this handwritten manuscript, which it would be wonderful to uncover one day. I don't know if we ever will find it. If Francis Woolcock's manuscript still exists anywhere, you can but hope. So we had these 12 to include, even though they're at a slight distance from the Roseland. They're close enough, and the fact that this book has never been republished, it seemed important to put these carols back into circulation. So it's 100 years, or nearly 100 years since this book has been printed.
So a lot of the remainder of the carols sort of came from miscellaneous sources, sort of seeped out of the woodwork, as I was saying, during the research. One of them came as earlier I related how Yvonne Fuller had come to our memory day, but it transpired again that she had written a carol called Thou Rose of Light, which she performed with the St Mawes Waits at the Tresanton Hotel on an annual basis. And Yvonne kindly worked with our music transcriber, Peter Meanwell, and we were able to include her carol in the collection, which is actually, I've heard the Washaway West Gallery Choir sing that carol, and it is quite delightful. And it's been a pleasure to include that in the collection as well. Some other carols came to us through memories of people. Significantly, Christine Edwards from Verrian Parish, who became a collaborator in the project with us, became our proofreader for the music.
Excellent proofreader.
Which was a lot of work and very useful job. But also, Christine has a personal collection of manuscripts that she's collected from various chapels and whatever, and has personal memories of aunts who played the organ at various chapels and churches. And there were some of the manuscripts that she had and personal memories of some carols and that being sung in the Verrian parish that we were able to incorporate. So, we were saying that one of the manuscripts that came to our notice through our work with Christine Edwards was Awake, Awake.
And that was fascinating. So, Christine had the manuscript because an aunt of hers or somebody had written it down, and she had ended up with a handwritten piece of music that was the result of somebody trying to remember and put down on paper a carol that was sung on Boxing Day morning in the centre of Portlow village. And Christine hadn't sung it because she's not from Portlow. But she knew of it and knew what it was. And luckily she could point us to a friend of hers called Joyce Gilbert, who agreed to meet us in the April of 2024. So it was probably the last carol that we really came across and made it into the book. So Nev and I and Christine and Joyce met in Portlow Church, and we'd had a look at this piece of music and we'd sent it to Peter, our transcriber, who was very excited by it because he had sung this piece with his gallery choir, kind of prospectively on the basis that it had been sung in Penrose, because he was working with some archive material that also included a reference to a carol called Awake, Awake, and he'd found what he thought was a likely candidate for it in some publication. And that's how we recognised it. So we sent him what Christine had provided. So he said, "Oh, I know this." And then, what Christine had was not really playable. That was the problem, wasn't it? She had tried to play it through, and she thought it didn't really kind of make sense as to what it was. It was, somebody's best guess at what they could get down. And so the idea of meeting up with Joyce was to see if we could play it through and figure out and have Joyce sing it. That was the marvellous thing. Joyce sang it for us and we recorded it. And then we provided that recording to Peter, who reconstructed how we think it was sung in Portlow, which, as we were saying about the sort of folk process and being washed in the generations, it's going to take on its own particular incarnation in a particular place. And so between Joyce singing it for us, Christine's transcription that was given to her, or that she had passed down to her, and Peter's knowledge of the song through his choir, we ended up with this reconstruction of Awake, Awake, which is lovely, because we've managed to have this piece of music sung again. It's been silent in Portlow probably all these years. I don't know if they sung it in at all at Christmas, but how it used to be done. The Methodist congregation would walk over from the church on Boxing Day morning into the centre of the village, outside the church, and sing Awake, Awake. And Joyce remembered it from her girlhood, which must be, I hesitate to guess a lady's age, but I would say it was probably the 40s. And it just got dropped out of use, and so it had been forgotten and might never have been sung again. And not to be too sort of saviourist about it, I feel very happy that between us and all the people that helped make it happen, this carol's been saved and is now in the book.
One of the things that we found interestingly, was that on the manuscript version, and we only found this by doing the practical exercise of going and playing it and listening to Joyce sing it, was that we found that not all of the words had been written on the manuscript to align correctly with the notes, the musical notes. And when they were shifted along slightly, things became a lot clearer, and that was one of the things that we found that enabled us to recreate it to the genuine version as it was sung in Porthscatho. So that was a great pleasure to be able to do that.
And then I think the last carols that made it into the book that we haven't talked about are some carol lyrics by Florence Attenborough or Florence Stodden, which don't have any music, but because they are carols, we felt should be included. And who knows, maybe somebody will write some music for them one day. The book was completed sort of towards the end of the year. It includes, the 40 carols and the music, and it also includes some history about each one, which I wrote with a lot of help from other people like Peter and Christine and Joyce and other groups that are interested in carols as well, that were kind enough to provide information. So we've got this was put together and finalised in the autumn of 2024 ahead of the carol service, and I suppose we'll go on to talk about that now. But just seeing as we were just talking about Awake Awake, a real high point of the service for me was hearing that sung and having Joyce and Christine there to hear it, which was absolutely lovely. But we should probably talk a bit more about the book and then setting up the service.
Yeah, one thing I should mention is that when we collected these 40 plus carols, we found that we had a carol connected with every parish on the Roseland, except one, which was Ruan Lanihorne. We found that we didn't have any carols connected with Ruan Lanihorne. So we decided that we would correct that omission, and we commissioned Gareth Churcher to write a new carol for Ruan Lanihorne. A couple of bits of background there are that there are some local historians in Ruan Lanihorne called David and Carol Hughes, and we asked them to become involved, and they were able to provide some notes on local history, and particularly some notes on colloquial local place names around Ruan Lanihorne that we were able to supply to Gareth Churcher as part of the commission. And another piece of background information here is that one of the other funders for the project that became quite significant was the University of Sheffield through their Access to Folk scheme. And they provided some funding to the project, but also were very useful because at various stages during the project we have to do, or Kate and I have done conversations with them, and they then provided suggestions about things that we can do and provided a valuable sounding board to provide suggestions of how we might be able to do things a little bit better and incorporate things. But the upshot of that is that the University of Sheffield don't fund religious enterprises. It's not anti-religious, it's just not what the purpose of their particular strand of funding is for. So when we commissioned Gareth to write this new carol for Ruan Lanihorne, it had to be a secular carol. So Gareth provided us with a secular carol entitled Ruan Lanihorne, which incorporates a lot of information on the Archdeaconry family, who were the family that lived in the castle at Ruan Lanihorne, but also in the chorus incorporates a lot of the local place names that David and Carol highlighted to us. So again, it was a great pleasure to be able to include a new work that related to Ruan Lanihorne in the collection.
So we've told the story up to about October, haven't we? So the book was finished and off to the printers by the end of October. But before that had started, we haven't yet come on to how the service happened in terms of who did the singing. So Emma Campbell nominated a friend and fellow musician, Pam Carbis, who I think you knew anyway, didn't you?
Yeah.
Who would take the carol element of the project forward, and figuring out how to get a service of Roseland carols practically sung was a bit more tricky, in the sense that there are choirs on the Roseland, but there wasn't a sort of continuing carolling tradition as there is, say, in St Ives or Redruth or Padstow. The point of this book and this work that we and everybody have done is to bring together material so that there can be, and there is a pool of locally relevant carols for people to pick up. And so part of what we decided would be brilliant for the service is if we could set up a new carol choir, and Pam was instrumental in making that happen.
Yeah, there was quite a difficult or complex period during the project at this stage, because the setup for the carol service is that we normally do the traditional 9 carols plus Lingham, but obviously they can be done in different combinations or different blocks. We also wanted to have at least 1 carol from each of the parishes of the Roseland so that it could be inclusive. So picking out which were the best carols from all of the different sources we had, so that we had so that we had 1 from each parish, and also I started talking to a lot of the choirs around the Roseland and singing groups to be involved, and the feedback that we got was that there was no 1 carol that could learn there was no 1 choir that could learn 9 new carols. So
it's too much of an ask around Christmas, which is such a busy time for choirs anyway.
So we found that the Roseland Church's choir were very helpful and wanted to be, and this is under Alison, and they became quite significant in the project and quite helpful. The Roseland Church's choir, we were, as Kate says, going to bring together this new choir under Pam, but we were still sort of 1 short, really, and I think it was Pam that put us in touch with Amici Bocci under Clive Brown, that could also sing some of those. So we, and also the other people that were involved in this was Emma Campbell and her band, the St Anthony Noise. So it became for me a little bit like trying to visualise 4-dimensional chess game.
It was.
To be able, but also bearing in mind that I neither sing nor read music. So for me, having to try and figure out which carols we would sing, which groups might sing them, and
then which might be accompanied.
And which ones might be accompanied by what.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that some choirs are confident enough to sing unaccompanied, other choirs just want a musical note to start them off, others require accompaniment throughout.
Yeah, and these are in 4 parts, and so if you're a choir that's used to singing in 4 parts, they're not tricky. But for the scratch carol choir, a new carol choir, learning to sing in 4 parts can be daunting. I don't think it's impossible by any stretch, because these carols come out of a church tradition where people would have been singing in harmony every week at church, but it's just not something that's commonly done now in most people's everyday lives. So learning to sing in harmony, while incredibly rewarding, can be daunting. So Nev's exactly right. Figuring out how all those differing needs were going to slot in together was quite tricky, but Pam did a fantastic job, and each of the choirs did a fantastic job, and we haven't even mentioned the fact that we had a children's choir yet.
No, I mean, that was one of the other choices that we made, was that this new composition that we had, Ruan Lanihorne, we decided that it would be nice to have some children involved in that. And the local guides troupe had said that they wanted to be involved. So that seemed to be another thing that we could do. We could bring in some children and that they might sing one of the carols. But again, that added another layer of complication and complexity into it. But that was quite difficult for me. But at the end, we kind of had to make an executive decision that, well, this is going to be it. This is what the choirs are going to be, and this is what they're going to sing. And when we got to that stage, it began to fall in place a little bit better. You know, it was all a little bit loose, and you were still thinking at some stages, how are we going to get this done? You know, it was that.
Yeah, and because we've got this music, we just need to get it heard.
But once we'd figured out which songs we were going to sing and who was going to sing them, it fell into place a lot better. Some of the things that made things easier were that, of course, Amici Voci could take the carols that we wanted them to sing, and they just took them off and rehearsed them themselves and learned them. Again, largely the same with the Roseland Churches Choir, with Alison. Again, took off her songs and rehearsed those. Again, we'd decided which ones were going to be accompanied by St Anthony Noise, so Emma could take care of that. So a lot of the work then became down to Pam Carbis and how we could pull together this choir, a scratch choir, to learn, 4 of the carols. Because some of the carols were sung by all of the groups and the congregations as well. So they had 2 carols that they were going to sing on their own, but also 2 other carols that were going to be sung in conjunction with the other choirs and the congregation. So Pam's role then was quite critical in terms of doing that, setting up the rehearsal times across the Roseland in the autumn of last year, bringing them together and rehearsing them with each of those carols. I went to all of the rehearsals except one that I couldn't get to. I provided the support in terms of putting together the packages of all of the music, complying with all of the requirements of University Sheffield in terms of their project requirements to get feedback, to provide all of the warnings for GDPR and all of those safeguarding and those sorts of things. And I felt personally that if I was asking these people to come and sing these carols, that I should turn up at the rehearsals and be with them. In retrospect, I'm really glad that I did, because I feel now that I went on the journey with them. I experienced what they experienced, because albeit that I can't sing, I did sing along with them, but quieter, so that I didn't ruin their performances. But I did. In retrospect, I did feel part of their journey as well as providing the backup for them. So there were rehearsals then throughout the Roseland at differing places, including at Tregony, and it culminated with a joint dress rehearsal in late November at Porthscatho at the Memorial Hall, where all of the choirs, including Amici Voci and the Roseland Churches Choir, the Children's Choir, and St Anthony Noise, were all involved, and that was crucial. But you know, again, I must emphasise that Pam was doing a lot of the organisation here, and it was absolutely essential to be able to do that dress rehearsal and to be able to have an evening where we Pam marshalled the troops and told everybody where they were going to be and where they were going to move. That was absolutely brilliant.
Because it is by far, I think, the most complex service of Cornish carols that has happened at the Cathedral. The Diaspora one was sort of similar in structure, in that there were 3 choirs and 3 banks of 3 carols, but we didn't have a band to accompany, and there wasn't a children's group, and so there was an awful lot to marshal, and Pam did an absolutely incredible job making it run incredibly smoothly, because with that amount of moving parts and moving people, the more shuffling and faffing around you have in a service, people get tired and it doesn't flow, and she made it flow brilliantly.
I should. We've mentioned the Children's Choir, which Pam was instrumental in pulling together and doing. But I need to mention one other person as well, which is a lady named Kay Robinson, who is the musical director of a singing group called Philleigh, and she became very much involved in the rehearsals with the children and making that fun in terms of the Ruan Lanihorne. And I think initially the children had some difficulty learning the words, but when they'd learnt the words, it clearly became more fun for them.
And they did a dance as well, didn't they? Well, not a dance, but some movements that they incorporated, some actions that that made it more of a performance, which I thought was lovely.
It was an interesting thing because it was the girls themselves in the choir that decided that they would like to do these gestures along with the singing, and we sort of went with it. But it was entirely their instigation and invention, but it clearly made it much more fun for them to be able to do that. They certainly, the choirs certainly enjoyed the sort of warm-up where they were singing the Pizza Hut songs and things like that as part of the warm-up in the rehearsals. But yeah, and again, I mentioned the dress rehearsal in late November, but one of the things we did there was that we got the children's choir to sing their song in front of everybody else at the dress rehearsal, so that they had an opportunity to perform it before they got to the cathedral.
I think that's really important because for the children, I think the cathedral could have easily been very overwhelming. It's a huge, impressive, beautiful space, and acoustically it's very different to anywhere that they would have rehearsed. So while Amici Voci have sung there before, I'm not sure if Roseland Church's choir would have sung there before, and the scratch choir, it would have been, going from I don't sing to now I'm singing at Truro Cathedral. That's quite a leap to make in the space of 3 months. So for all those reasons, the dress rehearsal, which was about a week before the service, I think, the service was on the 4th of December, was really, really important. And the night itself went smoothly.
It did.
We had a huge amount of help from a certain Chris Trevina, who stepped in to ensure that we were able to live stream the service in a way which had in previous years been done through Truro Cathedral, but they couldn't provide the same help this year. So Chris, who's behind the camera right now, stepped in to make sure that we could live stream onto the Federation of Old Cornwall Society's YouTube channel, which means that there's a record of it for the future. People can listen to it whenever they like, but also people could tune in if they couldn't come to the service. And I thought that was always hoped for as a part of the service, because there was a clash with late night shopping on the Wednesday night, and so there was not a worry that it wouldn't be well attended, but there were a few things happening. Like Truro's lost a car park, and there was late night shopping, and there were a few things going on which meant that logistically it wasn't quite as simple as it has been in previous years. So the live stream was incredibly important, and Chris made it happen. So
the whole organisation at the cathedral. We'd had several meetings throughout the year, and as I mentioned, Bert Biscoe was very much involved in the organisation at the cathedral end. But it was the whole organisation of the performance was much more complex than before, when you've got several musical groups and choirs to move around. You've got to decide to start with where they're going to sit, and then where they're going to move into place to perform different carols and things like that. So it was all much more complex. One of the things I should mention, that for the service is punctuated. The carols are sung in groups, but then we have short 5-minute talks by various people to sort of punctuate the service. And we had Reverend Doug Robbins from Philleigh coming and giving a short talk, and Christine Edwards, that we mentioned before, gave another talk. And who else was there?
Trounce Guy.
And Trounce Guy, who is from Port Holland on the Roseland, came and gave a talk as well. And then
his was in praise of old time preachers, wasn't it?
It was.
Christine's was Carols with My Aunts, and Father Doug Robbins.
Memories of Carolling Around Philleigh.
Memories of Carolling Around Philleigh, I think.
So
they were all. It was interspersed with stories of carols on the Roseland, and I think was Trounce's a poem. Or was it? I thought his was really beautiful. I mean, they were all fantastic, but I didn't know anything about Trounce before, and I was hugely impressed. And you and I had a chance to talk with is it Canon Allen? I'm never very good on titles.
Yes, Alan Bashforth.
Yes,
yeah.
Alan Bashforth. We had a chance to talk about the project, only quickly, but also how important carolling is to Cornwall and its overseas communities, which is, just a link back into the past and into the present. So overall, and it was really well attended. I was glad to see it looking so full.
There were in excess of 500 people in all at the cathedral, so it was a big success. And then, immediately afterwards, the number of people that were approaching me excitedly and enthusiastically, and also, immediately asking, how did we do this project, and could they replicate the project in their own area of Cornwall? So it was evident right away that we'd inspired quite a lot of people through the project. Should mention a couple more things about the book before I forget, because the book was launched that night at the cathedral and sold pretty well. Really very well at the cathedral. But I should mention that one of the other couple of things really is, I've mentioned the name Peter Meanwell before. Peter Meanwell transcribed all of the music into a common format to publish it in the book, and also in doing so imparted his knowledge about the history of the carols, which
he was
assisted
hugely
you.
helpful to me. It wouldn't be the book it is without Peter's either music or knowledge.
And I should mention also Terry Knight, who had the job of pulling the book together to make it a book, and did an extremely good job in terms of editing it in a relatively short period of time to get it ready for publication. Another person I should mention is that when you put a book together, you end up with some places where there would be white space. But we've included some postcards of places on the Roseland from the Argyll photographers, and they're all out of copyright, so they're all copyright free. But a lot of these were supplied by Frank Argyll, who is a descendant of the Argyll family, and so he was another contributor to the book. And we have given away, we financed the printing of the book through the project. And we have
That's what all of the parish councils were supporting, like all of the people who chipped in were supporting, but it's not just the printing of it, it's what you're going to go on to say.
Because we obviously supplied copies of the books back to the people that had funded it, but also we supplied pre-copies of the books to all of the Roseland schools, all of the choirs, and a number of other people across the Roseland, because our object with the project was to really publicise these carols and make sure that people knew about them and could use them for the future. So giving away a number of these books to people was always something that we wanted to do, and that we've also now sold a number of these since. So I just wanted to sort of round off a couple of other bits about the book that have continued to be a success. The cathedral performance was just fantastic, and Chris live streamed it, but subsequently he has split the carols and the talks out and created a new Federation YouTube channel, which they figure on and now are available for everybody to view, which is really brilliant. What else can we say?
Chris put together the band camp as well for the Federation of Old Cornwall Society, so that's another place that the Federation and these carols, importantly, has been heard on that wasn't before.
Chris has also been to the rehearsals of the Roseland Churches Choir and made some new recordings of the carol which figure on the YouTube site, and is also intending to do the same with Amici Voci as well, so that we will have some really good quality recordings that are going onto the site, which is just great.
Yeah.
We're very pleased with that sort of work. It just gives the whole project a different legacy. We have found since the project that there is enthusiasm now to do something this year, and I'm talking with the good people at Varian who want to put on a concert of some of the Roseland carols in December this year, but of course they want to include more of the Verrian carols in the mix. But so that's something we're starting to work on. We're also starting to work on some of the carols that we've got in the collection, that we might perform some of those in the Cornish language, and add those to other projects that the Federation back. So there's that going on. We also mentioned that we had collected some of Christabel's carols, which we only had the words to. One of those is actually an Easter carol, which is called In the Garden. And in the collection, we only have it in here with just the words. I can say that this year now, Yvonne Fuller and Peter Meanwell have worked with that carol, and I now have 2 new musical settings for that carol, one written by Peter Meanwell and another by Yvonne Fuller. So it just shows what you can do and what you can start to achieve with a legacy of a project like this when you've driven up enthusiasm.
It's wonderful to see it snowballing, isn't it? I think the very basic aim of this project started with was to collect Roseland carols, and we've come out with a collection and quite a lot more than that. And the hope is that it continues to snowball. You know, putting the book out there so that the music's in people's hands. And giving people the enthusiasm and the confidence that they can sing these songs, and I think what I love about the Cornish carols and the traditions I've been involved with or researched is that I'm not saying anything new or groundbreaking in this at all, but music creates community. Singing together is a shared experience, both between the singers and the listeners. And whether it's a one-off, you know, whether or not the Roseland Carol Choir continues 100 years into the future in the same format, or whether it moves and meanders and takes different directions and has dips and peaks and all the rest of it. The music is the vehicle for community, and the community is the vehicle for the music. I think it's this wonderful relationship, and brings people together in a way quite unlike other things. And so I'm drifting into slight incoherence now. But what I'm trying to say is I think that the project's had a simple aim, which I think has had a lot of resonance.
One other thing, I think you're right. Is that I think I said it earlier when we were talking, that when you bring music and dance into a sort of heritage project, it takes on a life of its own that's quite different and quite special. One other thing I probably should mention is that the Heritage Centre at Gerrans, we did put on an exhibition of Roseland music, including the carols, last year, and that's where we had held the Memory Day. So that premises sort of acted a little bit as an anchor for the project, and that we've submitted both the music of the Roseland Project and the Roseland Carol Project to the Heritage Awards this year. And I'm very pleased to say that both projects have been nominated for the Heritage Awards this year, and that Kate and I will be presenting at the Heritage Awards next month.
I think they've been nominated for innovation and collaboration, haven't they?
They have.
So we're very pleased that both those things have been recognised by the board there, and looking forward to the chance to talk about them to even more people in the east of Cornwall over in Liskeard.
They give tremendous pleasure, these sorts of projects, to be able to pull together and to do.
Yeah.
But at the same time, no one should underestimate how much hard work goes into it for everybody involved, you know, whether it's the person that's writing the book, putting the music together, doing the research, rehearsing the choirs. It is just, it's tremendously pleasing, and particularly when you look back on a lot of it, it gives you a lot of satisfaction. But, you know, I think that you've got to realise that they probably are 2 or perhaps sometimes even 3-year projects if you want to do them justice.
This ended up being a year in the planning and a year in the doing, didn't it?
Yeah, so giving yourself enough time, I think, would be my key bit of advice to anybody that was embarking on something similar.